Hi everyone, welcome to the Q&A on JavaScript frameworks. I'm going to get started in a couple minutes here. Just want to give other people a chance to join the call, or to start watching live, that is, I'm sorry. Basically, I'm going to be going through a lot of questions I was asked before, and just trying to answer everybody's questions about JavaScript frameworks. I'm going to mess with a few settings here for a second, and then we'll get started. Just making sure my mic is on, and I think we're good to go. So again, I appreciate everyone who took the time to join the call and has interest in various JavaScript frameworks, AngularJS, Ember, and Backbone. I spent most of the last year working on a book on the topic, the JavaScript Framework Guide, so I'm hopefully going to answer people's questions. So let's get started. So the first question is from McKeachie. He says, "Hi Craig, I'm planning to design a web-based UI for teaching about historical events to 8th graders. I was wondering if you could advise on which framework is best to design custom, in this case historical, interactive maps in the most optimum time. After researching on the topic, I have found the following options might fit my need: Cartograph.js and D3.js. And then he goes on to say, which of these do you think would make my life easier, as I cannot use Google Maps API or other predefined APIs to make my life easier? Please add any general suggestions as well, which you might think help me with making this project." Okay, well, first of all, thanks to everyone who sent in questions. I really appreciate it. I would have nothing to talk about if you guys hadn't sent these questions in. So let me start also by saying I'm not an expert on D3. I've seen a couple, I've looked at the site a few times, played with a little bit, seen a couple talks at user groups and conferences on it. But it is very low level, so it's not nearly as productive as traditional graphing libraries that you might be used to on the server. But if you like the D3 route, what might make you a little more productive is something called Topo.json. And if you Google Topo.json, I think you'll find a good sample from the creator of D3 that shows that. Like I said, I'm not a big expert. I can refer you to, I did see a great user group talk by @Neal on Twitter, which is @NEALL on Twitter, and I'm sure if you hit him up with the question, especially trying to pick between Cartograph and D3, he'd be glad to help you out and probably give you a much better answer than I. As far as MVC frameworks, MV, model view, whatever frameworks, initially I think it's quite a learning curve just to learn D3, Topo.json, Cartograph, whatever you end up using. So I would, get a few, I would hesitate against putting any framework in for a little bit, and then once you get comfortable with whatever charting framework you're using, or whatever, I guess can't really call it a charting or graphing framework, but once you get comfortable with whatever framework you're using to do the interactive maps, then I would see which of the frameworks, I would definitely lean towards one of the three I've written about in the book, Angular, Ember, or Backbone. Play best with that and introduce it as your code becomes more complex. I have a guess that probably Backbone might be the easiest, because with the other frameworks you're wrapping things in directives a lot of times to get low-level behavior, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And that could be a little more challenging, whereas with Backbone it doesn't really get in your way. It requires you to write quite a bit more code, but you have very fine-grained control with that. So let's move on to the next question. Thanks again for everybody for sending in their questions. So for people just joining, this is the Q&A for the JavaScript Framework Guide. Basically, I took my email list that I've been building up throughout the last 7-8 months, emailed them and said, hey, what are some questions you have about both about the book and about JavaScript frameworks in general? And I'd be glad to answer any of them. So that's what I'm doing here live today. So Will asked, are there any pre-release versions of the book available? So I did do pre-orders back in April and sold a few copies, gave out a few copies, and took feedback from numerous technical editors. But the book now is done and ready. So go to JavaScriptFrameworkGuide.com, JavaScriptFrameworkGuide.com, and check it out. And see for yourself. There is no more pre-releases because it is shipped and done. So we'll also ask another question. I just remembered I forgot to turn on my little banner here so I can stop saying JavaScript Framework Guide, JavaScript Framework Guide over and over again. Let's see, there's a little app. Let's see. McKeachie. So what I'm doing here is just putting up a little banner on the bottom. Thought I had it saved before, but you know how it goes. I'll just go live here on the reverse. There we go. Just so that way I can stop saying the URL. So there we are, Craig McKeachie, JavaScriptFrameworkGuide.com, and oops, forgot the whole guide thing. That's kind of important if I give people the wrong URL. Guide.com. Okay. So let me turn that off and on again. And looks like I actually spelled it right this time. Okay, here we go. So when I was watching the demos of how to do Google Plus Hangouts, a little aside here, the guy said the coolest thing you can do is point to this and say, so you go to JavaScriptFrameworkGuide.com. I'm not quite hitting it there, but anyway, I digress. So let's get back to the question. So Will's second question is, any treatment of React.js in your book? And the short answer is no, but I got to be honest with you. I think I'm going to probably add it because I've heard a lot of questions around it recently. I'll give you my current thoughts here in a second, but the book doesn't, may briefly mention React.js. I can't remember for sure, but definitely doesn't go deep into it. But it is catching fire. I got asked on Twitter yesterday. But so here's my take on it, though. React.js is only the V in the MVC model. Now, it crosses over a little bit because, if there were a letter for components, it's got a little bit of component stuff to it. And it's all about performance. So the way I see it right now is really the only places in your application where you have performance problems, like really large lists and so forth, or you're doing small performance optimizations, particularly in mobile scenarios, will you need a library like React.js to work with Backbone or Angular Ember. Another key differentiation is, I would say, why didn't I cover React? Well, it's very new. Another reason is it's not really a framework, right? So the book is about the MV frameworks. I could talk a little bit more about the name of the book later, but it's more of a library. It calls itself a library on its site. It just focuses on the V or the view, and so it's really not apples and apples to these other things. Now, that said, there is kind of a movement because people do have performance problems in Angular apps and Ember apps and so forth, rendering large lists. So people are starting to use React with these frameworks. So how easy is it to use React with these frameworks? I did a little bit of research. It looks like with Backbone, they regularly talk about it. Like I heard the authors of React on, it's from Facebook if people don't know. I think it's Pete Hunt, who was on there, and he was talking about, the examples he was mentioning were always bringing up Backbone, for example, because Backbone's pretty unopinionated. You could switch in your own view layer, and so forth. So it'd be really easy to work Backbone in with that. I have seen some examples online where people are able, with using directives, to plug in to get to the low level and plug it in to Angular in lists in problematic areas. Other people I did see some chatter on the Ember forums about, discussion forums about plugging it into Ember, but it doesn't look like anybody's done that yet. But so, needless to say, it's clearly in its infancy. I think it's a really good idea. Another way to look at React is, is to think about it like Knockout. So Knockout.js came out first, and there weren't any other JavaScript libraries available that did data binding that at least I know about. And people really wanting that, right? So it was innovative. Angular, I think, basically borrowed that idea and took it and put together some other stuff for a more complete framework. And as did Ember, borrowing it from Angular or from Knockout or both. So they borrowed it too. So in that case, Knockout was an innovator in the data binding area, innovative in the data binding area. And I think that I feel like React is, for the view layer, is a similar thing. So people are starting to run into performance issues, particularly string-based templating. Ember in the latest version is about to release something called HTML bars to replace handlebars. And it just sounds like it's more DOM-based because they found that they could do some performance optimizations when they didn't use string-based templates versus DOM-based templates. I got a last-minute question that's sort of related. When I was doing a little bit of research on the React stuff, I'll probably write a blog post on the React stuff talking about what I just said. But there's a Mitril framework that's MITHRIL that got some discussion on Hacker News. It has a virtual DOM similar to React.js, but appeared to be more a full MVC framework. So I think that might be interesting to look at. I don't have a ton of experience. I think it was confusing from their website what the advantage was, what their key differentiating factor was of that framework. But I've definitely heard some chatter about it, but really don't have much else to add except similar to React and the virtual DOM stuff. So let's take a pause here for a second, get a drink. For people just joining, this is a question and answer about the JavaScript Framework Guide, the book, which is AngularJS, Backbone, Ember, confidently choosing and quickly learning those frameworks. So I spent about the last year of my life reading up, learning about these frameworks, and writing a book on that, and I just released it this last week. So I'm taking questions from people who are on my mailing list about JavaScript frameworks, and I'm going to continue on. So not just about the book, to be clear, but about JavaScript frameworks in general, so hopefully everybody can get some value out of this. So Joe asked me, would you mind sending me a link to download the book? So yes. How convenient, Joe, for you to ask me that. You can buy the book at javascriptframeworkguide.com. Hopefully that's easy to remember, but I do have a little bit of story on why the book is named that to help clarify maybe a little bit about the scope of the book, as well as why I chose to name it that. So my first name was Single Page Application Book, but I came, as I did my research, to dislike that term quite a bit. Most people don't like the term single page application, even though it describes what these frameworks help you build. But well, there's many reasons for people not liking that term. The most prominent of which is the fact that it says it's a single page when in reality it's emulating many pages, so it's sort of contradicts itself. So here we go. So I started with that, and then I went to, well, maybe I'll call this the JavaScript MVC Framework Guide or book or whatever. And JavaScript MVC, the MVC part was the tricky part. A, that was quite a long phrase, and B, the more research you do, particularly Adi Osmani's writing on the topic, you realize that none of the frameworks are quite MVC in the sense that, the classic MVC pattern that we're used to, or the server-side, Rails type pattern that most people know about. These frameworks don't really match up one-to-one with those pieces. You can match the model up most of the time. You can match the view up, but controller is kind of elusive. Angular goes on record as calling it itself a model view whatever. You see that written as model view asterisk a lot. Framework. So, essentially there's a lot of confusion around the whole MVC thing and what's an MVC framework and what's not. So given that, there's frameworks and libraries are smaller, like we've talked about, and the frameworks are bigger and more ambitious and try to solve like multiple problems, like the ones we're discussing, such as, data binding and templating, routing, and et cetera, and providing you a model, perhaps an eventing system. So these are more frameworky, they're more ambitious in their scope. And so those are the kinds of things I'm writing about, and that's why I chose to leave the framework word, not use the library word, but drop the MVC. So that's how I've come to the JavaScript Framework guide, and I hope that clarifies things a little bit and gives you an idea for the scope of the book. I do talk about a lot of other frameworks and how JavaScript landscape is changing in the chapter The Rise of JavaScript Open Source, but don't go deep into those frameworks or libraries very much. Just the focus of the book is showing an example, which I'll talk about, the same example application written in Angular, Backbone, and Ember, and comparing and contrasting. Okay, I'm going to take another little break here. Hope I don't run out of water before I get to the end. Getting a little low over here. So the next question is from Joanne. And Joanne says, can you include details about Marionette? And she lists some topics she'd like to see covered, and lots of good ideas here. One in particular I liked is read the source code as explained by a pro. So my response to Joanne, I did send her a message today or a couple days ago, but basically it sounds like she's really looking for and interested in more information about Marionette. So Marionette is a plugin or add-on framework to Backbone, because Backbone is very unopinionated, very bare bones, not much architectural guidance, isn't really a whole framework in it itself. It's actually more of a library, which, but because of its popularity and because of it being the first one, I did include it with the book. But essentially that's what Marionette.js is. There's a competing framework, Thorax, that I think was built by Walmart, that does similar things, just has more of a sort of declarative lean, whereas Marionette has more of a JavaScript code-based leaning, if you will, or API. But the book itself doesn't really talk a lot about Marionette, except for to say, hey, it would be a good idea if you use this, because I show in the examples here is the things you do in initialize of a Backbone view, and here are the things you do in render, and you do them over and over again, and you follow this general pattern. Sometimes you skip one or two of the steps, depending on whether it's an item view or a collection view. And I talk about how this pattern repeats. And then I go into how that basically Marionette solves this problem or helps with it. And so I definitely recommend using Marionette or something similar with it in the book and discuss why and show why. But I don't go into deep details on Marionette, and that looks like what Joanne is looking for. So I really am trying, I hope you get the message here, I'm trying to explain, the book can't be everything to everybody. I'm trying to explain what's in it so you can determine whether it's right for you. So let's see what else I've got here. So I actually did send Derek Bailey, because he was part of the project. He included some of his screencast videos with the book, as well as an interview I did with him. And those are all available as some of the upper packages of the book. I also gave Joanne a bunch of links. Unfortunately, I think she probably knows about them already. But Derek has a PragProd set of screencasts on Backbone. He has a Backbone plugins book, which I think does address Marionette in it. And he helped Adi Osmani write a chapter in the Backbone Fundamentals book that talks about Marionette. He also has a screencast site, which I talked about, and may have some screencasts out there on that topic. For those who are more leaning to the Backbone and Marionette side, I really suggest Derek's Bailey's resources, derekbailey.com, for getting more information. I also forwarded Derek's email, or Joanne's email to Derek, because I know he likes to hear the suggestions. I mentioned one other thing, which is I've heard Derek say recently that the modules system that he wrote as part of the Marionette framework, he's not really happy with the way it turned out and sort of prefers to use Browserify now. So if you're just starting to use Marionette, that's a little helpful, useful tip. Okay. So the next question is from Alex. So Alex asks, does your book treat dependency injection and TDD and compare/contrast the implementation details of DI for each SPA framework? So the short answer is it does treat dependency injection, especially in promoting that Angular is very good with this. It doesn't go into deep detail with the other frameworks because, quite honestly, it's there, or possible to do with the other frameworks, but either buried in the internals, which I'll talk about, or not as evident. So let's talk more specifically about each framework and dependency injection. So Backbone allows the developer, it's so unopinionated that it, for better or for worse, I think you can tell by the tone of my voice how I feel about it sometimes, but I try to keep an unbiased opinion, so sorry about that. But it allows the developer to do dependency injection. I think it also raises an interesting question, which is, I've talked to some people who do a lot of Backbone. It's, if you know what you're doing, do you really need dependency injection in a dynamic language like JavaScript to do good testing? Or is it, can you mock out anything, stub out anything you need, and it's really not that important, especially with libraries like, I also had trouble pronouncing this one, Sinon or Sinon, SINON.js, which is good for mocking and stubbing and recording calls and so forth. So that's kind of my take on Backbone's approach. It's sort of, you can do it if you want, but doesn't lead you into the pit of success. Contrastingly, Angular's relative strength to the other frameworks is its testing. And even so far as Tom Dale, who's one of the Ember creators, has mentioned that Ember, he really admires Angular's testing story and thinks that's an area that Ember could improve on. And I think the key here is that dependency injection is just really easy with Angular, and it's baked in. Like it's hard to do anything without using dependency injection. It's just sort of baked in at the core of the framework. Everything's passed in on the constructor. It just shows up from the container. It's injected. It works. It's a very happy path. So it leads you to writing very testable code. Dependency injection is a deep internal detail of, or not deep internal, but an internal detail of Ember. And there's been articles written, blog posts I've seen on how it works in Ember. But I would say, for the most part, Ember does use dependency injection, but it's mostly just by you following their naming conventions. It sort of happens. So it's not as in your face as it is with Angular, for better or for worse. And it's not as easy to use yourself as Angular's DI is. Okay, and I hope that helps. So yes, I'm a big TDD guy myself. You can ask people I used to work with, and I do talk about it in terms of the pros and cons of the framework, as I just did in the book. So I just want people to know I do value that and see that viewpoint. So next question from, this was Alex, I think. Hang on. Yeah, another question from Alex was, does your book seek to draw out the relative strengths and weaknesses of the frameworks? And does it seek to draw out use cases for each? Do you have anything to say about how different kinds of teams may gravitate towards one or another framework? So yeah, this is definitely like, thank you, Alex. This is a very loaded question for me because this is exactly what the book is about. One thing I don't talk about a lot is the book is based on a Basecamp clone example application. So there's about 3 or 4 chapters in, I explain a little piece of Basecamp. I'm not going to say that I rewrote the entire Basecamp. That would be a bit naive, but I rewrote basically the project list page. So there's multiple projects and they have multiple lists underneath them, and the lists have multiple to-dos, and the to-dos can be assigned to individual users and be given a date and so forth. So that is the app that I wrote in all three of the frameworks, and you get to see what I went through as I did that, some of the pains and what was easier, what the code looked like in each of the frameworks. So I think the use cases come from me writing that application. Now, this doesn't cover every use case, as we'll discuss in your next question, but it does cover a lot of them. Particularly, I think what's different about this example application compared to most out there is there's hierarchical data there, as I described. So there's, projects that contain multiple lists, and the lists contain multiple to-dos. So that is something usually when you see example applications, they're a simple CRUD screen that edits users, does one thing, and doesn't do a whole bunch of things. So I think that's where people will be pleased with the examples in my book, I'm hoping. And at least so far, the feedback I've gotten has been very good from the book, and keep it coming. All right. So good and bad. I want to know how to improve it and all that. So how much of your book uses comparative approaches showing how each framework would solve the same problem? So this is very similar to Alex's last question. I'm particularly interested in reusable UI components like dialogues and menus and more sophisticated pieces of UI, like, for example, a photo gallery. So as I said, it's definitely based on that Basecamp clone application. I think that the major reusable UI component that came out of that was the date picker. And there wasn't a lot of other reusable UI components. I did write a couple other directives, but not a lot of other great use cases. So there is one, but maybe not one as sophisticated as what you're looking for based on your question. But it is in there, and there are relative comparisons. So something else I wanted to make sure I explained is, a lot of whether somebody's going to like a given book or comes down to when does it hit them in their learning process. So, you read a book on a new technology and you've never read anything about it, you're really going to appreciate it and think it's good if you're new to it. But if you're at a different point in your learning and you've become more of an expert, then reading the expert book, you're like, oh, that's the best book I've ever read. So it really depends on where you're at in your learning. So I want to help communicate who this book is for. So I think it is for the beginners, but it also gets into the more advanced topics. I think its other strength is showing a relative unbias across all the frameworks. A lot of the stuff you read just worries about the one framework. A lot of people only understand one of the frameworks. They don't truly understand the pros and the cons of the various ones, and that's the real strength of the book. So, I wrote this paragraph in the book. The book is for the developer who loves to learn, but is starting to have trouble keeping up. So I think that says a lot. So that's definitely a position I was in. I have been a developer for 15 years. And always kept up and enjoyed keeping up on top of technology, but I've never seen the rapid growth innovation as we're seeing in the JavaScript space right now. And I sort of explain why that is, what's happening, and so forth, and then I dive deep into it and try to get you caught up. It's for the developer who wants to build ambitious and awesome web applications. So the other key point here is this book is for somebody who's building classic server-side web applications, and they see this JavaScript stuff. Maybe they got some jQuery in their application that's getting more and more complex, and they're thinking, I'm ready to, this is getting a little clunky. So I need to refactor this jQuery. I want to write the same kind of code on the client that I traditionally write on the server. This book is definitely for you. I do assume you've built web applications before, for the most part. You're using PHP, Rails, ASP, Python, etc., and you're looking for information on how to build richer client applications. So some profiles of people that I think would get a lot of value out of the book are UI and UX people who value the UI really a whole lot, call themselves front-end developers. Perhaps someone who was into Flash, Flex, and or Silverlight, Microsoft's technology, and basically saw that Apple somewhat killed off a lot of those technologies, not entirely, but but killed off a large percentage of the applications being built in those, and wants to see where the world is heading. I have news for you. It's not necessarily a more productive world over here in the JavaScript space. We're getting there, but it is definitely a very familiar space, especially with Angular and Ember for those types of people. So if you're trying to figure out how to migrate your Flash, Flex, Silverlight skills, this would be a good book for you. If you're like an ASP.NET Enterprise developer or JSP Java Enterprise developer, and like I mentioned before, and your jQuery is getting a little messy or too complex, as you do more and more JSON calls to the server and so forth, this book is definitely for you. This is going to hit a sweet spot and explain to you how to get out of that and what your options are and contrast them. Also for Rails developers, if you've seen Backbone, AngularJS, and Ember examples, but you've been sticking with what you know with Rails, I think this is a great way to sort of compare and contrast that. Alex even asks specifically, I don't know if I addressed it, I do have a section in the book that talks about what kind of teams gravitate towards which of the frameworks. So the people in each of those camps, what kind of frameworks do they lean towards, stuff like that. So I'm not gonna, I think we've covered the half an hour here pretty good. I'm sure there's a lot of other stuff I could answer, but I'm gonna try to cut it off here. So I just wanna make one last call to the people who bothered to come on this call or watch it later, and that is, I'll do my thing here, to go to JavaScriptFrameworkGuide.com and check out the sample chapter if you haven't already, and consider buying it, because I think I think you'll know by now, by hearing this description, whether this book is for you, and I think it can save you a ton of time if you just think about what you bill yourself out at an hourly rate and how many hours of time I've spent trying to distill this information down to get to the point where, honestly, I have read 9, maybe 10 books just specifically on these topics, trying to get it to a point where it's a more coherent story and you can learn all this stuff at once. And so if that's your position where, you don't have kids or you don't have the time, whatever your hobbies are, and you just want to catch up in a hurry, I think this is a great book for you. So thanks for joining my call, and also remember JavaScriptFrameworkGuide.com. Thanks.